See, we should begin this. All right, let's begin this morning by going for refuge and arousing bodhicitta. O sanje chedan soge chonam la chanjo bardo Jabsumje Dage Jinsogi Pesunam Jidola Penjur Sanje Rumbar Sho Sange Chedan Sogi Chonam La Chancho Bardo Dani Jabsumje Dage Jinsogi Pesunam Ji Drola Penjir Sanje Robar Sho Sangye Chedan Soge Chonamla Chancho Bardo Dane Jabsumje Daki Jinso Gipe Sunamje Drola Penjir Sanje Drobar Sho. Okay. So today, if you just wait one moment, I've got a little issue with my internet. I'm going to see if I can improve it. Okay. Maybe this is a little bit better. So on the last 3 Saturday mornings, I've spoken a fair amount about motivation and some general issues with translation. For some of you, these are going to be further into the future. And some of you, these are issues that you might already be dealing with in your translation work now. Some of you, you've got a lot of learning to do. We all have a lot of learning to do. So at this point, if any of you, I mean, I don't really have any more general things that I can think of that I would need to say to you at this point. So I think the best thing, as I mentioned last time, is if you all have any questions or difficulties or other issues in general, then please let me know and we can see about, what do we say, talking about them. So I see Anna Carla has her hand up.
Yes. Hi, Khenpo. So I have a question that has
I'm sorry,
two
I'm
parts.
not getting any sound. Have I got my Zoom settings wrong? One moment, please. Okay, that's the problem. Can you repeat your question? I had my speaker set.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Thank you. So my question is, it has two parts. One is how to arrive to a final translation, which can feel some kind of confidence that it make justice to the integrity of the text, and at the same time, it has like, it got the emotional connection sense of the original text, that it could establish the connection with the reader in his or her own cultural context. And the second part is how to identify the signs that we arrive to the end of the process, because I have to confess that every time that I become involved in a translation, I feel very insecure when it's the end. Because always I find in every revision, I find new things to correct and to explore. So how can we identify that we can feel with confidence that is the end of the process?
Okay, so these are two good questions, actually, two very good questions. And I mean, it's kind of like if you put the two together, how do you know that you've actually done a decent translation, right? Because you, on the one hand, you have to want to get something that's going to communicate the original, and on the other hand, you want to have something that you're not going to have to go back and correct pile of times over the future. So the bad news first. The bad news is that you are going to have to go back. You are going to do translations that you think are very good. And you're going to have to go back and correct them, especially in your first few years translating. Some people go more quickly, develop more quickly than others. Some people, it takes a while. I look back at everything I did in the first 6 or 7 years I was doing written translation and think it needs a lot of editing, a lot of revision. I look at the things that I did in the next few years and I think that they need a fair amount of editing. And then I look at the things I've done more recently and I feel like it's a little bit better. So a part of it comes with time, continued study. This is, I guess I'm answering your second question first. It comes with time and with continued study and learning more, getting more experience, learning more. And one of the things that happens as you gain experience that can't come until you have the experience is that you gain a kind of a palette or sort of a grab bag of things. And you know that if you have this phrase in Tibetan, you can use this phrase in Spanish or Portuguese, right? And then it makes it much easier because you don't get to this new construction and then have to think, how do I express this? Well, it's like, oh, this is similar to that. So this isn't just dealing with the basic, the basic level, you've got terminology, but on the sort of, there's also the semantic level of when you have common sentences, constructions, or some common ideas, and you get some experience dealing with them, then you later on, you won't have to reinvent the wheel. You'll already have that experience and you know, oh, I did this. You might think, oh, there was a similar passage in another translation I did a couple of years ago. What translation was it? Where was it? And then you look it up and you can use something similar. So that experience for the second issue, the main thing is just getting experience, and that takes time. For me, it took several years. I've been working with another translator, and some people go, this one's going very quickly. Compared what he did a year ago and what he's doing now, it's just night and day. And so for some people, it goes very quickly, but it's more likely to go slowly. So don't get your hopes up. Now, so to go back to your first question about how do you know when you've got a good translation that can communicate feeling and that communicates the meaning? So a large part of this comes down to our, first of all, you have to have the knowledge of the topic and you have to work. And you have to be really skeptical of yourself. You have to be willing to question everything you said. If there are translations of the work into other languages that you can somehow access, for example, you might be able to find, you're translating work that's already in translations and use them as a guide. Look at when you translate into Spanish or Portuguese, right? So you should get all that. If you know, if you know Russian, then you get the Russian translation. If you know German, you get the German translation. I'm sorry. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, it's working.
I think I'm having internet problems this morning. Every few weeks, we have a day where the internet in my room just does not work well. And so that is, today might be one of those days. So I'm sorry about that. So on Ana Carla's first question about how do you know when you've got a good translation that communicates the meaning and that can make a connection to the reader, you've got to gather all your resources, the translations in different languages, the If you have access to it and you can read it, the Sanskrit, if it's there. If you know Chinese, you can get the Chinese translation. Or if you want to use Google Translate to check yourself, you can get the Chinese translation. I mean, you do everything you can. You get all your materials and you work with it. You need to really know the area that you're talking about, or you have to have a decent knowledge when you start. Your knowledge of the topic will increase as you work. So you will have you'll gain knowledge as you do it. You'll gain a better understanding of your subject. And you just check it with all the resources. There are many texts now that there's been a lot of academic work on them, and you might be able to find some academic paper and take a look at it. If you are doing, the 39th translation of the Heart Sutra into Spanish, there's tons of material on the Heart Sutra on the internet. So you get a look at it. So that's just kind of figuring out what's going on and getting an idea. And being skeptical of yourself, looking at your translation and always thinking, did I really get it? And not thinking that one of the big problems that will come up is when you get attached to some nice turn of phrase that you thought of in an early draft. It's a really beautiful word or beautiful phrase, but it's not quite right. But it's such a beautiful phrase, you want to keep it. I've got one in a translation I'm working on now that it took me like 3 drafts to get to the point where I thought it's really just wrong. I've got to change it. I love the words. Phantasmagorical, great illusion. Sounds great, but wrong. So you have to be skeptical. You have to question yourself and do that. In terms of communicating the feeling and the emotion, as I've spoken about, you have to have some sort of a feeling for yourself. So that comes with familiarity with the work, reading it, studying it. That just comes with time. In some works, it's easier to do that than others. Sometimes you just read something and the first time it strikes you. Sometimes it takes a while to get to it. And then you have to present it to other people, and you have to find out when you do this, have to get some feedback from other people. So it's always helpful to have a group of editors or fellow translators or people who are willing to review your work. And on the flip side, it's also always helpful to then do the same for other people. So people send you something, hey, how is this? Have people working together and see how it works, because you might be convinced that something is excellent, and everyone else is going to say, boy, this is really awkward. So you've got to get some feedback from other people. And then eventually you can put it out there. And you'll see how people react to it over years. And again, it's going to just be experience. You might think that with one of your translations that it's going to be really touching and move people and communicate the Dharma and all this. And it turns out later that it didn't. And then you'll have to think about why. Often, again, the problem comes down to our motivation. And the reason it comes down to the motivation is that we get attached to what we've done. We get proud about what we are doing. And because of that, we are unwilling to be honest about our own faults and the faults of our work. And so it's really critical to always look at your own faults, to look at the faults in your work, and to see whatever you can do to make them better. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, there's a chat down here. It might have come in while I was having problems. Yes. Internet problem. Chat. Any other questions today? Oh, yes, Gustavo.
Hello, Khenpo. My question is about if you are working on more philosophical texts, is it a good idea to have some knowledge of Western philosophy as well, so that we know how philosophy is dealt in our own languages, or is just Dharma philosophy is enough?
I think that it is important to have knowledge of whether it's philosophy or not, but especially with philosophy, it is important to have knowledge of the Western philosophy and the language used in Western philosophy, which doesn't mean that you have to start going out reading everyone from Aquinas to Kant to Wittgenstein. I'm not going to say that you have to do that. A little bit is good. Reading some of the introduction. There's some summary literatures on philosophy. You don't need to necessarily be able to dissect every Western philosopher's work. But on the other hand, you do have to have an appreciation for the language that they use. I mentioned the other day about the issue of the word ji in Tibetan, ji, right? So ji in Tibetan often translated in English as generality. It's referring to the same concept that in the Western philosophy is called universal. So do we use the word that other Dharma translators have used? Or do we use the word that is more accepted in general philosophy? So you've got to be careful. So you've got to be aware of that. Sometimes you also have ideas that are similar in Indo-Tibetan philosophy to ideas or structures in Western philosophy. And then you have to be careful about terminology, that you are not necessarily giving a wrong idea or giving a wrong impression. There's something that's similar. For example, again, in logic and epistemology, we have the issue of a chapa, because when something like we usually say pervades or permeates something. And this is used in a variety of different ways. And sometimes it's used in ways that in English, and in English philosophy, we'll talk about like necessity and so forth. If something is one way, then the other is necessarily the other way. So you have to think about, well, do you want to keep the word pervade, which has a whole bunch of other implications, or do you want to use the word that is like more common in Western logic and so forth? And it's not necessarily going to be 100%. Thou shalt always translate chapa as pervade. It's not that. It's more an issue of being sensitive to how it's used in the different languages. Now, this also comes up in a lot of other texts because it comes up in practice texts or in regular texts because we have all sorts of different spirits that you'll come across, especially if you're doing Vajrayana work. You've got Duns, you've got Roland, you've got Khandro, you've got all these different types of spirits that you have to then bring into Spanish or Portuguese somehow. And so you might be tempted to use then you have to be careful there. Like the word dun, if you translate it as spirit, well, a dun is a particular type of spirit, one that makes you sick and gives you a hard time. Or yedro, how do you translate these into a Western language? I mean, I've gone through it and think about, well, I've got, or J, do you translate J as ghost or as monster or what? You might think about using like some term from your own language, like in English. In English, many of our words for spirit seem to be borrowed from Irish. I don't know why that is, like banshees and things like that. So, if we translate some sort of Tibetan spirit as a banshee, then it's going to give people a whole different idea. So you have to be careful. Or there's another one, the Chungpo in Tibetan. Some often translated in English as an elemental spirit. So someone's taken, it's a type of spirit, and Jungwa comes from the word for element. Therefore, we have to call it an elemental spirit. If you look at what it actually refers to, it refers to the spirit of someone who's passed away that has not yet, that's hanging around and haunting people. And that's what we call in English a ghost. So you kind of have to look at the actual, so this is not philosophy, but this is looking at the usage of the words for different types of spirits in your own language. So it's the same issue. but a different range of vocabulary. So whether you're doing the philosophical vocabulary, or whether you're talking about different types of spirits, or whether you're talking about some other area, you have to kind of be very aware of the or you have to learn the kind of implications in Tibetan. You have to be aware of the implications of your own, and you have to see whether the two work together. Like rolang as zombie. Rolang, when we say zombie, you mean a corpse that has been reanimated in English and then is in a horror movie. But the rolang could actually refer to the spirit that inhabits the corpse and reanimates it. So that's a little bit of a difference. So do you want to use the word zombie with all of its implications in English? Or do you want to use the word rolang, or what do you use? So it's that's another area. That's probably a little bit more common when you're doing practice texts, but philosophy has also got plenty of words and constructions. And just the whole idea of the logical framework, how do you bring the logical framework in a way that's going to be sensitive to what Western logic is, but not necessarily go whole on. For example, what in Tibetan is called the thought, in Western logic would be called the middle term. Well, so do you use some translation of thought, or do you just use the word middle term as we do in English? These are things to think about. On that particular one, I tend to use the word evidence for thought. But anyways, there are specific issues, but you do need to be aware of the area in your own language, philosophy or spirits or otherwise, and the differences between that and the source material, and find out a way to bring the two so that you find something that overlaps the two and is clear. Okay. Does anyone else have any other issues? You've got Eberhard, yes.
Yes, I do actually. I do have two questions. So I was wondering if to become a good translator, as you were saying, does it come from working in translations, or does it come also from doing courses in between? Because how can I say that? So we do have a 5-year course long, and I don't know, does it, there is different kinds of translators, as academic translators, and or translators that are a little bit more closer to the teacher. Looks like I cannot be clear. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do understand what you're saying. I think it's going to be an individual, and it's going to depend upon your own situation, how you're coming in, what connections you have with teachers or other people. Your connections. I mean, if you get a really good connection with a good teacher at an academic institution, that can be a great way to learn translation for some people. As long as, I think the most important thing in all of it is being clear about your motivation from the beginning and reminding yourself of that constantly, because that's going to carry you through. When you're going through, you have to be aware of the pitfalls that are going to happen with any different route towards learning to translate. So for example, the way I learned to translate was almost entirely by trial and error. When I started translating, there were I wasn't aware of any translator courses, except there were a few academic programs where you could learn how to do it. And I definitely wasn't going to be going off to an academic program, at least not in the West. And so I ended up doing it by trial and error. And that, I think, is probably a longer period of time to learn how to do it if you don't have a teacher who's actually guiding you and saying you need to do this or that. Where my translation started improving is when, first with the oral interpretation, when my teachers gave me bits of guidance here and there. And then later with with the written translation, especially getting more guidance from from teachers and saying, this works, that doesn't work, use this word, do that, do this and that, answering questions. So whatever situation you're in, you need to have a good motivation. You need to make use of the resources that you have, and you need to be humble and willing to admit that you are wrong. I am constantly reminding myself that I'm full of shit. I'm just constantly saying to myself, you're just full of shit, and reminding myself that I'm saying. So that is an important, I think that's the way to do it. So I think my internet connection, but saying my internet connection is unstable again today. I hope that all came through. And
Yeah, we heard what you were telling yourself repeatedly, and so I don't know if you said something after that.
not really. What else is there to say to myself? Okay. Yeah, so I think Eberhard has a question now.
Thank you, Khenpo. Very nice to see you and to hear you. I have a couple of questions. First one is about how do we recognize an author's style in order to translate it into our own language? For instance, I think last time you talked about Milarepa's songs being translated into English in a Broadway style or an American country music style. Then there's this double issue of recognizing the style within Tibetan culture and making a connection to a style in our own culture, in the target language culture. So how do we do it? Especially in the beginning, I have no idea of Tibetan folk culture in order to pin, for instance, Milarepa styles here or there. And this is the first bit. And the second one, which is kind of connected, is if it's a song, a doha or something, something meant to be sang, or some practice, some sadhana text, how should we go about building sentences which are singable, so to speak, which for people to sing? Is it just counting syllables, or would you have some other recommendation? Thank you.
Okay, these are good questions. So the first one on the issue of recognizing the style and finding something that is appropriate to bring that into your own language. So that comes with recognizing the styles and so forth. That all comes with familiarity. So for example, with the songs of Milarepa, reading the songs, getting to know them, looking at other works. And so if you compare like the way the songs of Milarepa are put together and then, you know, another work like the way the Bodhisattva is put together, you can see that they're very different. You know, he'll often have points that he ends the line saying, Tang Chi, Tang Yi, Tang Sum, Te Sum De Ra. And so then he's got his own particular way of putting things together. And I haven't memorized many Milarepa songs, so it's hard for me to just bring them, but like the Song of the Three Nails and so forth, you've got to this point that, and so he has like these repeating points and he says 1, 2, 3. So that's like something to look at. He's got all these points. Now, where do I want to put this in English or in Spanish, in the target language? I guess you're going into Portuguese mainly, right? Where do you want to put it in your target language? If you've got a line from Milarepa that's saying, you know, the first 3 lines is saying in 1 and 2 and 3, do you want to, would you say, well, in English, you could either say first, blah, 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 or you can say blah, 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 blah for 1, blah, 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 blah for 2, blah, 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 blah for 3. So there are different ways you can put it together in your own language. You can play with it and see kind of what gives you the feeling. That's like, so that's kind of Okay, I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes. No, it's okay.
Yes. Okay. And I'm not sure where I got cut off there. It's an issue of my internet connection this morning. We have a cloudy weather today, so the internet is bad. So my apologies about that. I should do a puja to bring out the sun, except I don't know any. So like with the songs in Milarepa, you look at the internal structure of the words, and you kind of see, you have to get used to the different types of Tibetan verse. In the classical, in the Dharma translations, you've got generally tunsik tankunsik, so 7-syllable lines, 9-syllable lines. In more folk, and it's generally set up as sort of 2 syllables plus 2 syllables plus 3 syllables for the tunsik, or 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 3 for the gutsik. So when you see that sort of rhythm, it's kind of like the English equivalent of an iambic pentameter, or the French equivalent of an Alexandrine, probably something like an Alexandrine for for Spanish and Portuguese as well. So that's you have to recognize those forms in Tibetan and see kind of what, it's not, obviously when you say that like a gutsik in Tibetan is like a English iambic pentameter, it's not to say that they're the same thing at all in terms of the meter. What it is to say is that the usage of the two is similar. They're used for similar types of literature. And so then that's what you need to look for. Well, this is the type of folk song it is, or the type of literature it is in Tibetan. And this is the type of meter that we use in English or in the target language. And so then you put the two together and say that there's like some sort of a common thing. And like the gutsik and the jinsik in particular are like standard meters in Tibetan. And so in English, you put them in the most common meters, which would be like an iambic tetrameter or pentameter. And if you haven't studied English versification, that doesn't make any difference. They can mean anything to you. But then you need to look and see, well, what is the structure that's normally used in Portuguese or Spanish? What is used in more formal? What is used in less formal? What is used in folk verse? How do they work? And as you get to know that, then you can sort of get an idea. Oh, Milarepa is singing, he's generally singing he's speaking to folks, but he's speaking to folks in the 11th century. So what was kind of like an old speaking to folks sort of language in Portuguese like? Now, you may not want to go back all the way to the 11th century, particularly if you're in Brazil, as opposed to being in Portugal, because there are a lot of issues about the differences in language. But you want to find something that's going to be a little bit older, maybe some sort of 18th or 17th century style poetry or verse might work. So that's kind of like getting the style. And then the second part of your question is like getting good sentences that work in in Portuguese or Spanish verse. And so this requires that you learn how to work with the verse in your own language. You need to learn what is it like. You should, as I think I recommended a couple of weeks ago, you should get like a guide to writing poetry and learn what are the basic structures that people use. How do they work with rhyme? How do they work with rhythm? If you are only counting syllables, then it's not going to come out well. You also have to figure out how is it where sometimes you have a line that needs to kind of like break into different lines. You have to rearrange things, put things together to make it smooth. But what you want is something that's going to end up feeling kind of natural in Spanish or Portuguese, something that people are going to go, if it's kind of if it's awkward and kind of lumpy, then people aren't going to respond to it. And then you aren't going to be able, if people aren't responding to it, it's not going to then bring them any feeling or really accomplish what we want to do with a poet, especially with a poetic translation. So you need to just take the time to study the poetry, study Portuguese and Brazilian and Spanish poetry and see what can you do, how can you make it work. Then try to get study a range of it. So, I mean, I started out with like the standard college English Standard College English poetry book, the Morton Anthology of Poetry. It's all the old chestnuts, plus a few others. And you just get that, the Portuguese equivalent of that. What is the book that on your college survey course for poetry they make everyone read? Or the collection of poetry that everyone uses? Get that and read it. And just then you got to sit down and do the work of counting the syllables. You've got to, as we had a question the other day, in Spanish, you have a lot more rhyme. And I think you probably do in Portuguese as well. So you've got to look down and see, well, what are the rhyme structures? You just got to sit down and do a little bit of analysis so you can see. Okay.
Thank you.
Can I ask?
Yes, sure.
I would like to know from your experience and your point of view, if investing a big piece of our lives in translation will help or will harm our own Dharma practice or dedication to our practice.
Mm-hmm. That's an individual issue. And it depends on the motivation that you bring into translation. So again, we come to that issue, because if your motivation is that you're looking at it as a way to gather the accumulation of merit in order to achieve Buddhahood and to help all sentient beings, then it's a way to gather the accumulation of merit. If your motivation is kind of a selfish one, then it's not going to do too much good for you in your practice. And it also depends on where you are in the particular path. I mean, that there are, what do we say? People have we're all at different stages. And we might think we're at the stage where we need to practice, but actually might be in the stage where we need to serve. I mean, if you think about the different types of generosity, there's the generosity of material generosity, the generosity of service, and the generosity of practice. And so I think a lot of us have this idea that, oh, we just want to do the generosity of practice. I haven't got a lot of money anyways, I'm just going to go practice. Right? So we might be thinking something like that, but we might not be ready for it. It might be, so in general, it's taught that the generosity of practice is the most important, but it's not, and it's the highest form of generosity, but it's not necessarily the highest generosity for you. Your highest generosity may be the generosity of service, would be a translation, would fall into this category, or it might be material generosity. One, and that, so knowing that depends upon, you have to know your own situation, and you, hopefully if you have a teacher who will tell you what to do. I mean, you can go to a teacher and say, should I put more energy into translation, or should I put more energy into practice? So you have to look at it. I mean, translation on its own is not going to bring you to Buddhahood. It hasn't got me to Buddhahood, but because of my work in translation, because of trying to serve, I've become a better person. I feel like I've made a little bit of, a step or two of progress. So I'm not as bad a person as I used to be. It brings you a little bit forward, so it can be good, but it's not necessarily going to bring you to the ultimate result. I was reading a story, actually just this morning, I was looking at something. Rinchen Sampo, Otawa Rinchen Sampo. He met Atisha, and Atisha told him, it's time for you to practice, basically. So you're getting old, it's time for you to practice. And he'd done a tremendous amount of translation up to that point. After that, he then went to a retreat center. He had three doors. And in fact, let me get the story right. On one of the doors, it said, no unvirtuous thoughts are allowed inside here. Then the second door said, no neutral thoughts allowed in here. And then he had his inside, he had his retreat center, and he spent 6 years at the end of his life, and he was able to go to the pure realm of Kachari without leaving of any physical remains at the end of that time. So now that came from 6 years of practice. But did that 6 years of practice become fruitful because partially this is meditation on impermanence, large degree of that, but it also is probably, all the study, all the effort, all the service that he'd done over decades before he got to that point. So where you are personally is a different matter. And I can't answer that, but we have to, you have to look at yourself. It is, if you have the right motivation, it's a way to gather the accumulations and to purify your obscurations, which is the painful part. Okay. All right. Do we have any more questions this morning, or is that?
If no one else has a question, I may ask another one.
Sure.
So I was wondering, what's the importance of the closeness to the teacher, or to the Lama?
Yeah, the importance of being close to the teacher. That depends upon your own individual situation. If you want to be close to the teacher, you probably won't get close to the teacher. If you want to serve the teacher, then there's a chance, but it might not work out. Teachers, whether it's going to end up being you or not, is a little bit in terms of how ready you are for it, how pure your motivation, basically that thing. So that's not just a translation question. That's sort of a general Dharma serving question. But the most important thing is that if you have a pure motivation, and constantly trying to make sure that your motivation is pure, and you're willing to put up with a lot of problems and difficulties, and you are able to stick it through, then you will find you'll be more likely to have opportunities to serve your teacher. The more you want to serve your teacher, the more you want for yourself to serve your teacher, the less you'll be able to serve your teacher. The more you want to just, like you don't care what it does, likely you will be able to actually serve the teacher. I think I mentioned how my work with the Gyalon Karmapa began as I started out transcribing melodies and helping people to sing, and then doing organizational work, doing calendars and so forth, wondering, when am I going to be allowed to translate? And it was only after I said, okay, he's just got another translator, and that other translator is good. I'm just giving up. I'm going to do whatever he wants me to do. It's only after I came to that point myself that I started getting opportunities to translate. And I no longer saw them as opportunities to translate. It's like, I've just got to do what I can to serve, whatever he needs. I am willing to do my best to do it. And so if you can come to that same sort of feeling, then even if you don't see the teacher, for example, I haven't seen the Gyalon Karmapa for 5 years. I haven't seen Trungpa Rinpoche for 2.5 years. But on the other hand, the closeness isn't necessarily being right there. Closeness is how willing you are, how much you're going to give up of your own. This isn't translation talk. This is just Dharma talk. This is how willing you're able to put your own thoughts of what you might need aside, and to just devote yourself to doing what the teacher needs, and doing what will benefit sentient beings in the teachings. And then you will see that you'll actually start to be able to serve. But if you're in it for yourself, even in a subtle level, it's not going to get anywhere. So give up on this life. Forget about this life. Then you might have a chance of becoming a good translator, a good servant for the teacher and the teachings.
If no one else has any question, then maybe I have one.
Okay.
It is about, I still struggle with finding the right amount of modification that I can do in order to bring the style forward without betraying the original. So how much am I allowed to modify the translation or the original in words or in meaning in order to suit the target language?
Okay, this is a very good question. The first thing is, this is, I think, goes back to the issue I was speaking about, like the style of translation, how literal versus how meaning. And so like Tibetan is a more literal translation, Chinese is a more freer style of translation. So I think the first thing is that if you compare the Tibet, just take a model of what the Tibetans did when they translated from Sanskrit. They changed the order of the words to make it into a Tibetan order of the words. And the texts where they did not change the order of words are incomprehensible or difficult to understand. They felt free to, they changed the order of the words. They felt free to add more lines in poetry or do fewer lines in poetry. So they are not wedded to having exactly the same number of lines as in the original. They decided that having the straight dunsik was more important, and that the only way to fit the meaning in was to put it on 5 lines instead of 4, or 3 lines instead of 4. So, so the formal constraints, you pick a form that you're going to do, and then you need to fit the material to the form, which might mean that you can do more, that you have to add more in French, or maybe less lines in French. There are going to be times when you probably can do something more concisely in French than you can in, I don't know, now that I think about French, maybe it's hard to say anything concisely in French, I don't know, but there are going to be ways you're going to find where you might have to do a stanza in 3 lines in French, depending upon the structure of it. And in terms of the words, you have to bring the word, you have to use the words that go over that then convey the meaning in French, which means that you can't have like a one-to-one correspondence of Tibetan word versus French word, as you probably already know. You just can't do that. It doesn't work. If you try to do it, it's just going to be incomprehensible in English, in French, or it's going to have a very different connotation. So those are all the areas that you can be flexible with. And then, of course, you need to take things and put them in grammar that is going to work in your language. So something that is expressed in Tibetan without a subject of the sentence is not going to work without a subject of the sentence in French or in English or probably in Spanish or Portuguese either. You need to have a subject of the sentence. And sometimes if you're doing like a namtar, you know, if you're translating that, you're going to have to put in the names of the people who are speaking, or it's just going to be incomprehensible. You'll have things that are in kind of like a strange passive construction in Tibetan that then need to go into an active construction in your language. So that's all sort of like moving it around. So, and putting it into something that's going to work and expressing the meaning. When you have an idiom in Tibetan, like for example, if you're translating something about someone has passed, a great lama has passed away, it says in Tibetan, "Xingshet." Yana Shenden Pepa. If it says that, if you write in English, you know, he went to benefit sentient beings, other sentient beings, no one's going to know what it means. So you got to bring it into English in an English idiom that means the same thing. He passed away. He left this lifetime, something like that. Now, of course, and you have to be careful here because you wouldn't want to say he kicked the bucket. You have to use an appropriate, you know, sort of idiom for what you're doing. So you can change the idioms. When you have examples, you might need to change the examples somewhat so that they make sense in your language. For example, I was working on something a couple of weeks ago where they're talking about jujube fruit, or what, I don't even know how to say it. I know how it's spelled in English. It's jujube fruit, and it's some Indian fruit, and I think I've seen it in India, and it's smallish and it's round, and if you don't have a bowl, it's going to roll away. So instead of saying jujube fruit in English, which no one is going to know, I said berries, because it's the analogy that's going to make sense. So that's a sort of modification that I think is okay, because that's not changing the meaning really. I mean, yeah, changing from a jujube to a berry is like, it's some people might think it's a terrible sin or something, but it's not. I mean, I think it's just bringing it into it. Now, where the issue is, you have to be careful is when you are thinking, this is not clear in my language, you have to look at how clear is it actually in Tibetan. For example, if you are translating, I'll go back to another one that I know, that some texts on Abhidharma, like the Treasury of Abhidharma, you've got a root text that was intended not to give full explanations, but to give a verse that people can easily remember so that then they can remember the teachings of the master. Right. So this is the function of the verse. It's not to give a complete explanation. It's to remind you, like the one line I remember from the 3rd chapter that kind of sticks in my mind is that I translated as unpleasant sound 8 equals square. So you've got the northern continent of unpleasant sound. It's 8,000 leagues in circumference. They're equal in length, and it is a square. But in the Sanskrit and the Tibetan, it doesn't give any of that explanation. It says 8 equals square. So how do you deal with that? And if you start writing it all out in that type of verse, instead of translating the verse, you're writing a commentary on the verse. So there's a fine line between commentary. You've got to look at the original. So my rule of thumb is if it requires explanation in the original, it's going to have to require explanation in the translation. If you are afraid to present it without explanation in the translation, then you can put in footnotes, especially with something like Abhidharma, or you can present it with a commentary that will explain it later, and then you don't have to do the footnotes in the root text, right? So you've got to look at that. What's the eventual publication, and so forth. The problem with inserting things to make it clear is that often we're inserting things that make one interpretation of it clear. And there are other interpretations in other works. So you have to be very careful of that. There are the problems that where you are, for example, in one Madhyamaka work, the translator put in a lot of extra words to make it flow better, to make it sound better, to give kind of a better idea of the range of the meaning, and inadvertently introduced logical contradictions. So that's something you have to be very afraid of. So you have to see how little can I get away with adding while at the same time making it idiomatic and understandable.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe you can be of some help. The thing that I recently came over and really I didn't find a satisfactory way of dealing it was this. It was in the visualization of the Ngondro and the refuge tree, and at the end it finished with so literally it's like an open pod of a season seeds, and the meaning should mean something to the reader. If I keep it as it is, then I really don't know what to do, and I don't feel that is also changing what is said. And I didn't know what to do with that.
Yeah, so that's actually a very good example because the Tildutsam that's such a common metaphor, especially when you're talking about the wisdom deities coming or whatever, when you have a lot of in visualizations. So you do need to keep the metaphor because, or to keep the same basic metaphor of sesame seeds in that one, because people will see it in other texts and you want to be able to have a connection. It could be, you could do it something like, how would you say it? Like in English, we might say something like a bushel of sesame seeds pouring out, or something like a bushels of sesame seeds pouring out, something like that. So like it's like, instead of like opening it up, it's like, you know, in English we think about pouring the sesame seeds pouring down or something like that. That might be a way to do it. It is a difficult issue. To how do you get that? And you can't. I'd probably start working with something like, you know, like bushels of sesame seeds pouring down or something like that. And then I just have to sit down and look at what's coming before and after and how to fit it in and all that.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, maybe we've gone an hour this morning, so this maybe is a good time to stop for today. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak about, try to answer your questions. I hope it was helpful. And I'm also very grateful for this opportunity to spend four Saturday mornings for me, 4 Saturdays, sometime on each of 4 Saturdays speaking with you. And I hope that this has been, what I've had to say is somehow beneficial for all of you. And most of all, I'm very glad to see all of you thinking about translation and thinking about doing it in Spanish and Portuguese. This is extremely important. As I think I said in the first talk, Tibetans sort of expect that everyone, all of us who have big noses and yellow hair, even if the hair isn't yellow, we all still have yellow hair. They expect that we all speak English, and that's of course not the case. And it's really important for all the people who are hungry for Dharma in so many countries throughout the world where Spanish and Portuguese are really the languages that people know and people feel. And to be able to bring people the Dharma in a language and hopefully in a way that they can all feel and appreciate is a really wonderful thing to even to wish to do, to even to think about doing at the beginning. So I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join and for taking the time to study translation. And I wish you all the best in your continued studies. And of course, you should all feel if you have more questions or issues, you should feel free to contact me. I'm not always going to get back to you immediately, but I will try to if I can. So I'd like to be able to help all of you as you continue along your studies and work as translators. So thank you very much. So let's close with the dedication of merit. Vasanam tam jese bani tomne bejanam panchete gegana chimbar long trobai sibe solero kunyoro sho. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khenpo.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Khenpo. Thank you, Khenpo.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll see you all later.
Yeah.